Tony Bennett stopped his concert. What he said to a crying woman changed the night. Few voices in American music carried the weight of an entire era quite like Tony Bennett. Born to Italian immigrant parents in New York City, Bennett rose from poverty and wartime service to become one of the most respected singers in the history of popular music. While the world remembers him for timeless classics like "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," few truly know the challenges, quiet battles, and defining moments that shaped his extraordinary career. From smoky jazz clubs to the world's greatest stages, Tony Bennett's story is not just about fame, it is about resilience, dignity, and a voice that refused to fade with time. This is the true story behind the legend, a journey of talent, struggle, and timeless grace. The autumn wind of 1936 cut through the narrow streets of Astoria, Queens, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and the distant aroma of fresh bread from Benedetto's corner bakery. 10-year-old Anthony Dominic Benedetto pressed his nose against the cold window of their cramped apartment, watching his father Giovanni struggle up the front steps, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of another difficult day. Giovanni Benedetto had arrived in America with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that hard work could lift his family from poverty. The Great Depression had tested that faith mercilessly, turning each day into a battle for survival. He worked multiple jobs, sometimes as a grocer's assistant, other times hauling ice blocks up tenement stairs, always searching for the next dollar that might keep his wife Anna and their 3 children fed. "Papa's home," Anthony whispered to his younger siblings Mary and John, who were huddled around the kitchen table attempting homework by candlelight. Electricity was a luxury they couldn't always afford. Anna Benedetto looked up from the thin soup she was stretching to feed 5 mouths. Her dark eyes, once bright with the dreams of a young immigrant bride, now carried the weight of constant worry. Yet when Giovanni entered, removing his worn coat with movements that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion, she managed a smile. "How was your day, caro mio?" she asked, in the mixture of Italian and English that filled their home. Giovanni's response was a weary shake of his head. The construction job he'd been counting on had fallen through, another casualty of an economy that seemed to devour hope as quickly as it could be rebuilt. Anthony watched his parents exchange a look that spoke volumes, a silent conversation about bills unpaid and tomorrow's uncertainty. But it was in this moment of despair that something extraordinary happened. Anna moved to the old upright piano that dominated their tiny living room, its keys yellow with age and several notes permanently silent. She began to play a gentle melody, a lullaby from the old country that her own mother had sung. Giovanni's weathered face softened, and almost without thinking, he began to hum along. His voice, rich and warm despite the day's hardships, filled the small apartment with something that transcended their circumstances. Anthony felt something stir within him, a recognition that music possessed a power beyond anything he'd previously understood. "Sing with us, Anthony," his mother called, her fingers dancing across the worn keys. At first, the boy was shy. His voice was changing, cracking at unexpected moments, making him self-conscious. But as his father's baritone wrapped around the melody and his mother's alto provided gentle harmony, Anthony found his own voice joining the family chorus. The sound that emerged wasn't polished or professional, it was something far more precious. It was hope made audible. The neighbors, the Castellanos from upstairs, had been arguing loudly just moments before. Now their apartment fell silent. Mrs. Rodriguez, the widow from next door, paused her evening dishwashing to listen through the thin walls. The Benedetto family's music had transformed their building into something approaching a sanctuary. For 20 minutes they sang together, Italian folk songs, half-remembered church hymns, and melodies that seemed to emerge from the collective memory of their heritage. Anthony discovered that when he sang, the gnawing worry about his father's unemployment faded. The embarrassment of his patched clothes and cardboard-soled shoes became irrelevant. Music, he realized, was a place where poverty couldn't follow. When the impromptu concert ended, the apartment fell into a peaceful quiet. Giovanni sat heavily in his favorite chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth for the first time in weeks. "You know, Anthony," he said, his English carefully measured, "your voice, it has something special." The boy felt a flush of pride and confusion. "What do you mean, Papa?" "Music is like medicine," Giovanni explained, his hands gesturing expressively as they always did when he spoke of something important. "It can heal things that doctors cannot touch. When you sing, you make people forget their troubles. That is a gift from God." Anna nodded in agreement, closing the piano lid gently. "Your grandfather back in Calabria, he had the same gift. People would come from neighboring villages just to hear him sing at festivals. He could make grown men weep with joy." That night, as Anthony lay on the narrow cot he shared with his brother John, he stared at the water stain on the ceiling that always reminded him of a map of some distant exotic land. But instead of dreaming of escape, he found himself thinking about his voice, this mysterious gift his parents claimed he possessed. The next morning brought devastating news that would alter the course of Anthony's life forever. Giovanni, who had seemed tired but hopeful the previous evening, failed to wake up. The doctor who came spoke of heart failure, of a man who had simply worked himself beyond his body's capacity to endure. At 39 years old, Giovanni Benedetto had given everything he had to provide for his family, and his heart had finally said enough. The funeral was held at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, where the Benedetto family had worshipped since arriving in America. Father McManus, who had baptized all 3 Benedetto children, spoke of Giovanni's dedication to his family and his unwavering faith despite overwhelming hardship. But it was when Anna, supported by her children, stood to sing Ave Maria that the congregation truly understood the depth of their loss. Anthony's voice, still high and clear despite his 10 years, joined his mother's in a harmony that seemed to carry every ounce of their grief and love. The church fell completely silent, except for the sound of quiet weeping. Mrs. Castellano later said it was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing she had ever heard. A son and mother saying goodbye through song. After the service, as neighbors and friends offered their condolences and what little financial help they could spare, Anthony overheard conversations that would haunt him for years to come. There was talk of the family needing to split up, of the children perhaps going to live with relatives who could better afford to care for them. The apartment rent was beyond Anna's ability to pay working as a seamstress, and the depression had made jobs for widowed mothers nearly impossible to find. That evening, in the apartment that now felt impossibly empty without Giovanni's presence, Anna gathered her 3 children around the kitchen table. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady with resolve. "We will stay together," she declared. "I don't know how, but we will find a way. Your father believed that with hard work and faith, anything was possible. We will honor his memory by proving him right." Anthony looked at his mother, this woman who had just lost her partner in a foreign country, facing poverty with 3 children and no clear path forward, and saw something that would influence every decision he made for the rest of his life. He saw grace under pressure. He saw dignity in the face of despair. He saw the kind of strength that couldn't be taught, only witnessed and absorbed. "I'll help, Mama," he said, his young voice carrying a determination that surprised even him. "I'll quit school and find work. I'm old enough." Anna reached across the table and took her eldest son's hands in hers. They were already showing calluses from odd jobs he'd been taking to help the family, small hands carrying responsibilities no 10-year-old should bear. "You will not quit school, Anthony," she said firmly. "Your education is the one thing your father insisted we never sacrifice. But," she paused, looking at the old piano, "perhaps there are other ways you can help. Your voice, this gift, maybe it can do more than just bring us comfort." That night, Anthony made a promise to himself and to his father's memory. He would use his voice not just to escape their circumstances, but to transform them. Music would be his weapon against poverty, his shield against despair, and his bridge to a better future for his family. He couldn't have imagined then that this promise, made by a 10-year-old boy in a cold tenement apartment in Queens, would eventually carry him to the greatest stages in the world. But perhaps, in the deep wisdom that only children possess, he understood something profound, that music was indeed medicine, and he had been given the prescription for healing not just his own family's wounds, but those of anyone who would listen. As the autumn wind continued to rattle their windows and the sounds of the neighborhood settled into nighttime quiet, Anthony Benedetto, who would someday be known to the world as Tony Bennett, began to understand that his real education was just beginning. Chapter 2. The Sound of Survival. By 1940, 14-year-old Anthony Benedetto had learned to navigate the streets of New York with the practiced efficiency of someone twice his age. The boy who had once pressed his nose against cold windows now walked with purpose through the bustling corridors of the subway system, his shoeshine kit slung over his shoulder and his mother's lunch wrapped carefully in brown paper tucked under his arm. The Benedetto family had managed to stay together, but survival had come at a cost that measured itself in more than dollars. Anna worked her fingers raw, taking in sewing from the garment district, often working by lamplight well into the early morning hours. Mary, now 12, had become the family's second mother, managing household duties with the seriousness of an adult. John, barely 8, collected bottles and scrap metal with the dedication of a small businessman, counting each penny as if it might be their last. Anthony had found his own way to contribute through a combination of traditional odd jobs and something entirely unexpected, his voice. What had begun as family sing-alongs around their old piano had evolved into something far more ambitious and necessary. "Anthony, you ready?" called Jimmy Roselli, a 16-year-old from the neighborhood who had become both friend and business partner in their informal entertainment venture. Jimmy played guitar with the natural talent of someone who had learned by ear, picking up melodies from the radio and transforming them into something uniquely his own. They had discovered their partnership by accident 3 months earlier, when Anthony had been singing while shining shoes outside Penn Station, and Jimmy had started accompanying him on guitar. What happened next had surprised everyone, including themselves. People started stopping, listening, and most importantly, dropping coins into Jimmy's open guitar case. "I'm ready," Anthony replied, adjusting the collar of his only good shirt. Anna insisted he look presentable whenever he performed, understanding intuitively that appearance mattered as much as talent when asking people to part with their hard-earned money. Their destination this particular Saturday afternoon was Washington Square Park, where crowds of college students and Greenwich Village artists gathered to debate politics, share poetry, and escape the oppressive summer heat. It was an audience unlike the rushed commuters at Penn Station or the working-class families in their own neighborhood. These were people who had time to listen, to appreciate, and occasionally to be generous with their spare change. Setting up near the fountain, Jimmy began tuning his guitar while Anthony surveyed the crowd. He had learned to read audiences the way a meteorologist reads weather patterns, understanding which songs might resonate with young couples strolling hand in hand, which melodies might appeal to the older gentleman reading newspapers on park benches, how to adjust his approach based on the mix of people within earshot. "What do you think?" Jimmy asked, his fingers finding the opening chords to Summertime, a song that had become one of their most reliable crowd pleasers. "Good choice," Anthony nodded, then closed his eyes briefly, centering himself in the way he had learned through trial and error. When he opened them and began to sing, something magical happened. The casual chatter of the park seemed to quiet. Conversations paused mid-sentence, and heads turned toward the source of this unexpectedly mature voice emerging from such a young performer. "Summertime, and the living is easy," Anthony's voice carried across the park, with a clarity and emotional depth that seemed impossible from someone who hadn't yet celebrated his 15th birthday. He had discovered that when he sang Gershwin, people didn't just hear a teenager trying to make pocket money. They heard something timeless, something that connected them to their own memories and emotions. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a wealthy widow from the Upper East Side who had come to Washington Square to sketch, set down her charcoal and pad to listen more intently. There was something about this young man's voice that reminded her of the singers she had heard in the finest nightclubs of her youth. Yet there was also something raw and authentic that those polished professionals had somehow lost. As the song concluded, a small crowd had gathered, and the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. Anthony smiled and nodded his thanks, but his attention was caught by an elderly man standing at the edge of their impromptu audience. The man was impeccably dressed despite the summer heat, wearing a three-piece suit and holding a walking stick with an ornate silver head. Most remarkably, he was weeping. When the applause died down and people began to disperse, dropping coins and bills into Jimmy's guitar case, the elderly gentleman approached. His name, he explained in a voice flavored with a slight European accent, was Professor Wilhelm Steinberg, and he taught music at Columbia University. "Young man," he said to Anthony, his voice still thick with emotion, "where did you learn to sing like that?" Anthony glanced at Jimmy, uncertain how to respond. The truth was that he had never taken a formal voice lesson in his life. His education had come from listening to records borrowed from the public library, from imitating singers on the radio, and from the countless hours of family singing that had sustained them through their darkest moments. "I just sing," Anthony replied honestly. "My mother plays piano and we sing together at home, but I've never had real lessons or anything like that." Professor Steinberg studied the boy's face intently. "Would you be willing to sing one more song? Something slower, perhaps more challenging?" Anthony looked at the growing pile of coins and bills in Jimmy's case, more money than they had ever earned in a single afternoon. But something in the professor's manner suggested this wasn't about the money. This was about something more important. "Jimmy, can you play Body and Soul?" Anthony asked, his friend's eyebrows raised in surprise. It was a sophisticated jazz standard, far more complex than their usual repertoire, with chord changes that demanded both technical skill and emotional maturity. But Jimmy nodded and began the intricate introduction. What happened next would be talked about in Washington Square Park for months to come. Anthony's interpretation of Body and Soul was nothing short of revelatory. He didn't just sing the lyrics, he inhabited them, telling a story of heartbreak and longing with the wisdom of someone who had experienced profound loss. His voice soared and whispered, built tension and released it, transforming a popular song into something approaching art. Professor Steinberg wasn't the only one moved to tears. Mrs. Patterson found herself thinking of her late husband, remembering their courtship and the songs that had provided the soundtrack to their young love. A group of college students who had initially planned to listen for a few minutes found themselves captivated for the entire performance. When the song ended, the silence stretched for several heartbeats before erupting into the kind of applause usually reserved for concert halls. Professor Steinberg stepped forward, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out not coins, but a crisp 5. The morning fog rolled thick over the Hudson River as Anthony Benedetto stood at the rail of the troop transport ship, watching the distant silhouette of New York fade into grey obscurity. It was March 1944, and the weight of his rifle felt foreign against his shoulder, a stark contrast to the microphones he'd grown accustomed to holding during his brief but promising stint performing in local clubs. The ship's deck was crowded with young men, most barely out of their teens, all carrying the same mixture of nervous excitement and quiet dread. Tony found himself studying their faces. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from Boston, all united now by the olive-drab uniforms and the uncertain future that lay ahead in war-torn Europe. "Hey, Benedetto!" called out Jimmy Kowalski, a stocky kid from Brooklyn who'd somehow managed to smuggle a harmonica past the MPs. "Give us a song, would you? Something to take our minds off this mess." Tony hesitated. The urge to perform was still there, burning quietly in his chest like a pilot light that never quite went out. But everything felt different now. The stakes were higher, the audience more vulnerable. These weren't nightclub patrons looking for entertainment. They were scared young men heading into hell, and they deserved something real, something that acknowledged their fear without drowning them in it. "What do you want to hear?" Tony asked, his voice carrying easily across the crowded deck despite the wind and engine noise. "Something from home," called out a red-headed soldier whose name tag read Murphy. "Something that reminds us what we're fighting for." Tony closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of the ship's engines beneath his feet, the salt spray on his face. When he opened them again, he began to sing, not the popular hits of the day, but an old Italian folk song his father had taught him years ago, translated into English for the mixed crowd. His voice rose clear and strong above the ocean wind, carrying notes of longing and hope that seemed to wrap around each soldier like a warm embrace from home. As he sang, Tony noticed something remarkable happening. The nervous chatter died away, replaced by a profound silence that spoke of shared humanity rather than mere attention. Men who moments before had been strangers began to move closer together, drawn by the music into a temporary brotherhood that transcended regional accents and cultural differences. Some closed their eyes and let memories wash over them. Others openly wept for sweethearts and families they might never see again. When the song ended, the silence stretched for several heartbeats before spontaneous applause erupted across the deck. But it wasn't the enthusiastic clapping of an entertained audience. It was something deeper, more grateful. These men had been given a moment of peace in the midst of uncertainty, and they recognized the gift for what it was. "That was beautiful, son," said Sergeant O'Brien, a grizzled career soldier who'd been watching from the upper deck. "You've got something special there. Don't let this war take it away from you." Tony nodded, but privately wondered if that was even possible. How do you preserve something as delicate as artistic sensitivity when you're being trained to kill? How do you maintain faith in beauty when you're surrounded by the machinery of destruction? The weeks that followed provided harsh answers to those questions. Basic training in England was a brutal awakening to military life. Endless drills, forced marches through muddy countryside, and the gradual stripping away of individual identity in favor of unit cohesion. Tony's hands, once soft from years of focusing on music, became calloused from handling weapons and equipment. His voice, strained from shouting commands and responses, lost some of its smooth quality. But it was the psychological preparation that proved most challenging. The officers spoke matter-of-factly about killing techniques, about the necessity of destroying the enemy without hesitation or remorse. They showed films of Nazi atrocities that left the entire company sitting in stunned silence, trying to process the reality of human evil on an industrial scale. "The thing you've got to understand," explained Captain Morrison during one particularly difficult briefing, "is that this isn't about personal animosity. This is about stopping a machine that's grinding up innocent people by the millions. Every day we delay, more families are destroyed. Every moment of hesitation costs lives." Tony understood the logic, but his artist's heart rebelled against the dehumanization required for effective combat. He found himself writing letters home to his mother that he could never send, pouring out his confusion and fear onto paper before burning the pages in the small stove that heated their barracks. The crossing to France came in June, just days after the initial D-Day landings. Tony's unit was part of the massive follow-up wave designed to secure the beachhead and push inland toward Germany. The Channel crossing was rough, with many soldiers seasick and miserable, but Tony found himself oddly calm as they approached the French coast. The first thing that struck him was the smell. Smoke and cordite mixed with something else, something organic and terrible that he would later recognize as the scent of death itself. The beaches were still littered with the debris of the initial assault, broken landing craft, abandoned equipment, and crude graves marked with makeshift crosses and stars of David. "Welcome to France, boys," muttered Kowalski as they waded through the surf toward the blood-stained sand. Looks like quite a welcoming committee they prepared for us. The march inland revealed a countryside transformed by war. Villages that had stood for centuries lay in rubble, their ancient stone churches reduced to skeletal frames, reaching toward an indifferent sky. Refugees trudged along the roads, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, their eyes holding the hollow look of people who had seen too much and lost everything that mattered. It was in the town of St. Vith, during what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge, that Tony truly understood the weight of war. His unit had been assigned to hold a strategic crossroads against a German counter-offensive, and for 3 days they endured artillery bombardment that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Tony crouched in a foxhole with Murphy, the red-headed kid from Massachusetts, watching the sky light up with explosions that made the 4th of July celebrations of his childhood seem like children's games. Between the deafening crashes, they could hear something even more terrifying. The cries of wounded men calling for medics, for their mothers, for God to make the pain stop. "I used to think I knew what fear was," Murphy said during a brief lull in the bombardment. "Getting called on in class, asking a girl to dance, that kind of thing. But this," he gestured helplessly at the chaos surrounding them, "this is something else entirely." Tony nodded, understanding completely. The fear of combat wasn't just about personal survival. It was about witnessing the complete breakdown of everything civilized and decent, watching human beings reduced to their most primitive instincts. It was about learning that the world could be far more cruel and arbitrary than any young man should have to discover. When the bombardment finally ended and the German infantry began their assault, Tony found himself doing things he never thought possible. Training took over, muscle memory guiding actions that his conscious mind couldn't quite process. He fired his rifle at distant figures moving through the smoke, not thinking of them as individuals with families and dreams, but simply as threats to be eliminated. The fighting lasted 14 hours. When it was over, half of Tony's unit was dead or wounded, and the survivors sat in stunned silence among the bodies of both friends and enemies. Tony looked down at his hands, still steady despite everything, and marveled at how quickly a person could adapt to the unthinkable. But it was what happened next that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As medics worked frantically to save the wounded, Tony heard a sound that cut through all the chaos, someone singing in German. Following the voice, he found a young Wehrmacht soldier, probably no older than himself, lying against a shattered wall with what was obviously a fatal wound to his chest. The German soldier was singing a lullaby, his voice growing weaker with each note, but maintaining a heartbreaking sweetness that transcended language barriers. Tony recognized the melody. It was the same tune his own mother had sung to him as a child, though with different words. Without thinking, he began to hum along, creating a brief moment of shared humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. The German boy's eyes found Tony's, and for an instant they weren't soldiers from opposing armies. They were just two young men who understood the universal language of music and loss. The enemy soldier smiled weakly and continued singing until his voice faded into silence and his eyes closed forever. Tony sat there for a long time afterward, holding the dead boy's hand and trying to process what had just happened. Here was someone he had been trained to kill, someone whose death he should have celebrated as a victory for his side. Instead, he felt only a profound sadness for the waste of it all, the waste of talent and potential, of songs that would never be sung and stories that would never be told. When Kowalski found him there, he didn't ask questions. He simply sat down beside Tony, and together they watched the smoke rise from the ruins of what had once been a peaceful farming community. The war would continue for several more months, and they would see many more battles, but this moment became a turning point in Tony's understanding of what it meant to be human in an inhuman world. The winter of 1944 settled over the Ardennes forest like a shroud, bringing with it a cold that seemed to penetrate not just clothing and skin, but the very soul itself. Tony's unit had been reassigned to support operations following the Battle of the Bulge, tasked with clearing German resistance from small towns and villages scattered throughout the Belgian countryside. It was during these operations that Tony began to see a different side of war, not just the dramatic clashes of major battles, but the slow, grinding process of liberation that revealed the true scope of human suffering. Each village they entered told its own story of occupation and resistance, of ordinary people caught between opposing forces and forced to make impossible choices simply to survive. In the town of Malmedy, Tony's squad was billeted in what remained of a local church, its roof partially collapsed from artillery fire, but its walls still standing strong. The parish priest, Father Dubois, had somehow managed to continue holding services throughout the occupation, though his congregation had dwindled to mostly elderly women and young children, whose fathers were either dead, imprisoned, or fighting with the resistance. "Music," the priest explained to Tony in heavily accented English. "It was how we kept hope alive during the dark times. When the Germans forbade our songs, we hummed them quietly. When they took our books, we sang the words from memory. They could control our bodies, but not our spirits." Father Dubois had heard about Tony's musical abilities from other soldiers and asked if he might provide some entertainment for the war-weary townspeople. Tony was hesitant at first. His voice felt rusty from months of shouting orders and breathing cordite smoke, and he wasn't sure he remembered how to perform for joy rather than simply survival. But something in the priest's weathered face, in the quiet dignity with which these people had endured so much suffering, convinced him to try. That evening, as snow began to fall outside the damaged church, Tony found himself standing before a small group of Belgian civilians, most of whom spoke little English, but all of whom seemed hungry for something beyond mere words. He started with "Silent Night," thinking the familiar Christmas carol might bridge the language barrier. His voice, though rougher than before the war, still carried that distinctive warmth that had made him popular in the New York clubs. As he sang, he watched faces transform, worry lines softening, eyes brightening with something that might have been hope. An elderly woman in the front row began to cry, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was remembering something beautiful from before the war, some moment of peace and celebration that Tony's music had momentarily restored to her. When he finished the song, she stood on shaking legs and began to sing the same tune in French, her quavering voice joined by others, until the entire church resonated with multilingual harmony. "You see," Father Dubois whispered to Tony as the impromptu chorus continued, "music speaks truths that politics cannot touch. In your voice, they hear not American or Belgian or even human. They hear the voice of the divine, reminding us that we are more than our sufferings." The words stayed with Tony through the remaining weeks of winter campaigning. As his unit moved from town to town, he began to understand that his musical gift carried with it a responsibility that went far beyond entertainment. In a world torn apart by ideology and hatred, music offered something increasingly rare, a glimpse of shared humanity that transcended national boundaries and political differences. But the war was not finished testing his resolve. In early March, Tony's unit was among the first Allied forces to liberate a small concentration camp near the German border. Nothing in his training, nothing in his imagination could have prepared him for what they found there. The stench hit them first, a combination of human waste, disease and death that was so overwhelming several soldiers vomited before they even reached the main gate. Then came the visual impact. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, moving like ghosts among wooden barracks, their eyes holding depths of suffering that seemed to go beyond what human beings should be capable of enduring. Tony walked through the camp in stunned silence, trying to process the systematic cruelty that had created this nightmare. These weren't casualties of battle. These were victims of deliberate, methodical dehumanization, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. The sight of children among the prisoners, their tiny bodies bearing witness to incomprehensible evil, nearly broke his spirit entirely. But it was in the camp's makeshift hospital that Tony encountered something that would shape his understanding of resilience for the rest of his life. Among the patients being treated by army medics was an old man named Samuel, a violinist from Vienna, who had somehow managed to keep his instrument hidden throughout 2 years of imprisonment. "They took everything," Samuel explained in accented English as Tony sat beside his cot. "My home, my family, my health, everything except this." He gestured toward a battered violin case tucked beneath his bed. "Music was all I had left of who I used to be." Samuel's hands shook from malnutrition and disease, but when he lifted the violin to his shoulder and drew the bow across its strings, something magical happened. The haunting melody that emerged spoke of loss and longing, but also of dignity, maintained in the face of ultimate degradation. Other survivors gathered around, some humming along to tunes they remembered from better times, others simply standing in reverential silence as beauty was conjured from the depths of human darkness. "During the worst times," Samuel continued when he finished playing, "I would practice fingering positions without the violin, running through entire concerts in my mind. The guards thought I was losing my sanity, but really I was preserving it. Music kept me connected to the person I had been before this hell, and the person I hoped to become again if I survived." Tony understood then that his own musical gifts carried obligations that extended far beyond personal success or artistic fulfillment. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was a form of resistance against everything that sought to reduce human beings to mere objects of hatred and manipulation. Every song was an act of defiance against the forces that would strip away dignity and hope. The recording studio at Columbia Records felt different in 1962 than it had just 5 years earlier. The walls that once echoed with the swing of big bands now vibrated with something entirely new. The electric pulse of rock and roll, the folk revival's urgent harmonies, and the Motown sound that was reshaping American music. Tony Bennett sat in Studio A, adjusting his tie and staring at the microphone that had become both his lifeline and his anchor in an industry that seemed to be drifting away from everything he held sacred. "Tony, we need to talk." Mitch Miller's voice cut through the studio's ambient hum like a blade through silk. The legendary A&R man who had guided Tony's early career now wore the expression of a doctor delivering difficult news. His usually confident demeanor carried an undercurrent of tension that made the air in the room feel thick and charged. Tony turned from the mic, his dark eyes meeting Miller's with the quiet intensity that had become his trademark. At 36, Bennett had already achieved more than most singers could dream of. Multiple hit records, sold-out concerts, television appearances that had made him a household name. Yet standing in this temple of American music, he felt like a stranger in a world that was rapidly changing around him. "The numbers are in from the last album," Miller continued, settling into a leather chair that had hosted countless meetings between artists and executives, dreams and reality. "They're not what we hoped for, Tony. The market is shifting and we need to shift with it or risk being left behind." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Through the studio's thick windows, Tony could see the bustling streets of Manhattan, where teenagers walked with transistor radios pressed to their ears, tuning into sounds that bore no resemblance to the great American songbook that had shaped his artistic soul. The Beatles were conquering America, Bob Dylan was speaking to a generation hungry for change, and the smooth sophistication of traditional pop was beginning to feel like an artifact from another era. "What are you suggesting, Mitch?" Tony's voice carried the careful control of a man who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of the music business. He had watched other artists of his generation, singers who had ruled the charts just a decade earlier, fade into obscurity as they struggled to adapt to changing times. Miller leaned forward, his hands clasped in a gesture that Tony had come to recognize as the prelude to uncomfortable truths. "We want you to consider recording some contemporary material, rock and roll numbers, maybe some folk songs that are connecting with younger audiences. Your voice could bring something special to this new sound." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished cigarette. Tony felt something tighten in his chest, not quite anger, not quite fear, but a deep resistance that came from the very core of his artistic identity. He had spent years developing his craft, studying the masters, learning to interpret the sophisticated compositions of Gershwin, Porter, and Berlin. The idea of abandoning that tradition felt like betraying not just his artistic vision, but his very soul. "I understand the business considerations," Tony said carefully, his fingers unconsciously finding the rhythm of a half-remembered melody on his thigh. "But I'm not sure that's the right direction for me. The songs I sing, they mean something. They have a craftsmanship, an emotional depth that I'm not finding in this new material." Miller's expression softened slightly, revealing the genuine affection he held for the young singer who had become one of Colombia's most reliable artists. "Tony, I respect your artistry more than you know, but we're running a business here, and if we can't sell records, we can't support the kind of music you want to make. Sometimes adaptation is survival." The conversation continued for another hour, moving through the familiar territory of artistic integrity versus commercial necessity. Tony listened to Miller's arguments, understanding the logic, even as every fiber of his being resisted the path being suggested. He thought of his father, dead now for more than 25 years, and wondered what Anthony Benedetto Sr. would have said about compromise and staying true to one's principles. When he finally left the studio that evening, the streets of New York seemed to reflect his inner turmoil. The city lights blurred past the windows of his taxi as he rode home to his apartment, where his wife Patricia waited with dinner and the normalcy of domestic life. But even surrounded by the comfort of family, Tony felt the weight of a decision that could define the rest of his career. The following weeks brought a series of meetings, phone calls, and recording sessions that felt increasingly disconnected from his artistic vision. Columbia presented him with songs that climbed the charts, energetic rock numbers, folk anthems, and pop confections that bore no resemblance to the sophisticated ballads that had made his reputation. Tony tried, recording several tracks that would never see the light of day, his voice struggling to find authenticity in material that felt foreign to his musical DNA. It was during one of these sessions that he experienced what he would later describe as his moment of clarity. Standing before the microphone, attempting to breathe life into a song that felt hollow and manufactured, Tony suddenly stopped mid-verse. The studio musicians continued for a few bars before gradually falling silent, confused by the singer's unexpected pause. "I can't do this," Tony said quietly, his words barely audible in the soundproofed room. "This isn't me. This isn't who I am as an artist." The silence that followed was profound, not just the absence of sound, but the presence of a moment that would reshape the trajectory of his career. Tony looked around the studio at the faces of musicians and producers who had watched countless artists compromise their vision in pursuit of commercial success. In their expressions, he saw understanding, disappointment, and perhaps a touch of admiration for a man willing to risk everything for artistic integrity. The phone in Tony Bennett's apartment seemed to ring less frequently in the spring of 1968. Each silent morning brought the uncomfortable reality that the music industry, the world that had embraced him so warmly just a decade earlier, was moving in directions that felt increasingly foreign to his artistic sensibilities. Tony sat at his kitchen table, reading reviews of the latest rock albums while sipping coffee that had grown cold as he contemplated the growing distance between his music and popular taste. Patricia found him there most mornings, surrounded by newspapers and trade publications that chronicled an industry in revolution. The Beatles had released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band the previous year, permanently altering the landscape of popular music. Bob Dylan's Electric Transformation had split the folk world in two, Meanwhile, Tony Bennett, once hailed as the heir to Sinatra's throne, found himself struggling to fill smaller venues and watching his record sales dwindle with each release. "Another review of that new Aretha Franklin album," Patricia said gently, settling beside her husband with her own cup of coffee. She had learned to read the subtle signs of Tony's frustration, the set of his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed silent rhythms on the table when he was working through difficult emotions. Tony nodded, his eyes still fixed on the newspaper. "She's extraordinary, Pat. The power in her voice, the way she connects with audiences, it's everything music should be, but it's so different from what I do." He paused, folding the paper with careful precision. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm becoming a relic." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Patricia had watched her husband navigate the peaks and valleys of artistic life, but this period felt different, more profound and potentially permanent than the temporary setbacks that were inevitable in any creative career. The man she had married possessed an unwavering confidence in his artistic vision, but lately she saw traces of doubt creeping into his performances and conversations. Their phone rang, breaking the morning silence with its urgent insistence. Tony answered with the professional warmth that had never left his voice, despite the personal struggles. It was his booking agent with news of another cancelled engagement, a casino in Las Vegas that had decided to go with a more contemporary act for their summer season. "I understand," Tony said into the receiver, his voice betraying nothing of the disappointment that Patricia could read in his posture. "Yes, I hope we can work together in the future." He hung up and returned to his coffee without explanation, but none was needed. The entertainment industry of the late 1960s was experiencing seismic shifts that went far beyond simple changes in musical taste. The counterculture movement had embraced authenticity and rebellion, creating audiences that viewed traditional pop singers as representatives of an establishment they were actively rejecting. Tony's sophisticated delivery and elegant presentation, qualities that had once defined him as the epitome of American cool, now marked him as part of a generation that younger listeners associated with conformity and compromise. Yet Tony's response to this rejection revealed the depth of his character. Rather than retreat into bitterness or attempt radical reinvention, he doubled down on his commitment to the music he loved. He spent hours at his piano, working through the standards that had shaped his artistic identity, finding new meanings in familiar lyrics and discovering emotional depths he had missed in earlier interpretations. His apartment became a laboratory for musical exploration, where he experimented with different arrangements of classic songs, always searching for ways to make the familiar feel fresh without sacrificing the essential qualities that made these compositions timeless. Patricia often found him at 3 a.m, still working at the piano, his voice soft and contemplative as he explored the subtle shadings of a ballad he had sung hundreds of times before. One evening, as autumn painted the trees of Central Park in brilliant oranges and reds, Tony received an unexpected call from Frank Sinatra. The chairman of the board, as he was known throughout the industry, had weathered his own periods of artistic and commercial challenge, emerging stronger and more focused than ever. His voice on the phone carried the wisdom of experience and the warmth of genuine friendship. "Kid," Sinatra said, his distinctive cadence unmistakable even through the telephone static, "I've been watching what you're going through, and I want you to remember something. The music we love, the real music, the songs that matter, they don't go out of style, they just wait for the world to catch up." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering everything from the current state of popular music to the challenges of maintaining artistic integrity in a commercial industry. Sinatra shared stories of his own lean years, the periods when critics dismissed him as passé and venues treated him as a nostalgia act rather than a vital creative force. "You keep doing what you're doing, Tony," Sinatra concluded, Don't let them change you into something you're not. The world needs singers who understand what a song is supposed to do, not just entertain, but touch something real inside people. That's what you do, and that's what matters. After hanging up, Tony sat in his living room as darkness settled over Manhattan, processing the encouragement from an artist he deeply respected. The conversation had reminded him that artistic careers were marathons, not sprints, and that periods of commercial drought were often necessary for creative growth. The following months brought small but significant opportunities. Intimate club dates where Tony could connect directly with audiences who appreciated sophisticated songcraft, recording sessions for smaller labels that gave him greater creative control, and collaborations with jazz musicians who understood the value of the American songbook tradition. These experiences, while less glamorous than his earlier mainstream success, reconnected Tony with the essential joy of musical performance. In small venues where every seat was close enough to see the emotion in his eyes, he rediscovered the intimate connection between singer and audience that had first drawn him to music as a child in Queens. The Copacabana nightclub in 1972 bore little resemblance to the glittering palace of entertainment it had been during Tony Bennett's early career. The famous venue, once the crown jewel of New York nightlife, where celebrities mingled with socialites and every performance felt like an event, now struggled to fill its tables with audiences who seemed more interested in conversation than music. Tony stood in the narrow dressing room backstage, adjusting his bow tie in a mirror that had reflected the faces of countless performers, many of whom had since faded into obscurity. The engagement at the Copa represented both an opportunity and a potential humiliation. Once, performing at this legendary venue had been a mark of having truly arrived in show business. Now, it felt like a test of whether Tony Bennett still belonged in a world that had seemingly moved beyond his style of sophisticated entertainment. 5 minutes, Mr. Bennett, called the stage manager, a young man who clearly knew Tony's reputation without having witnessed his earlier triumphs firsthand. His tone carried the professional courtesy reserved for respected veterans, tinged with the uncertainty that surrounded artists whose commercial peak appeared to be behind them. Tony took a final look in the mirror, seeing not just his own reflection, but the ghost of the confident young singer who had conquered these same rooms 20 years earlier. The face looking back at him showed the accumulated experience of a life lived in music, lines earned through countless performances, eyes that had witnessed both the soaring highs and crushing lows of an artist's journey. The walk to the stage felt longer than he remembered, each step carrying the weight of expectations and the possibility of disappointment. But as Tony emerged into the dim lighting of the Copa's main room, something shifted in his demeanor. The uncertainty that had plagued him in private evaporated, replaced by the professional grace that had never truly left him, even during the darkest periods of his career. The audience was smaller than the capacity crowds of his heyday, scattered across tables where conversations continued in low murmurs as he approached the microphone. Tony surveyed the room with the practiced eye of a performer who had learned to read every subtle sign of audience engagement, noting the mixture of longtime fans, curious newcomers, and industry professionals who might be there to witness either a comeback or a farewell. "Good evening," he said simply, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with a clarity that immediately focused the room's attention. "I'd like to sing some songs for you tonight." What followed was not the desperate performance of an artist trying to recapture past glories, but something more valuable, the mature artistry of a singer who had learned to distill his craft to its essential elements. Tony opened with, "I left my heart in San Francisco," not as nostalgia but as a statement of artistic identity, his interpretation deeper and more emotionally complex than the version that had made him famous. The response was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations stopped, glasses were set down, and the room's energy focused entirely on the man at the microphone. Tony had discovered something during his wilderness years that younger performers often missed: the power of absolute authenticity, the way genuine emotion could transform even familiar material into something revelatory. As the set progressed, Tony felt the familiar alchemy of live performance taking hold. Each song became a conversation between artist and audience, his voice carrying not just melody and lyrics, but the accumulated wisdom of a life lived in music. He sang The Good Life with the understanding of someone who had experienced both abundance and scarcity. I Get a Kick Out of You with the sophistication of a mature artist who could find humor in romantic complexity. During the instrumental break of Fly Me to the Moon, Tony stepped away from the microphone and simply listened to his trio, piano, bass, and drums, create their own dialogue with the melody. The moment represented something profound about his evolution as a performer, the confidence to let music breathe, to trust in the power of silence and space, to understand that not every moment needed to be filled with vocal performance. The audience. The executive boardroom at Columbia Records in 1973 felt like a courtroom where Tony Bennett was both defendant and witness. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling streets of Manhattan, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Around the polished mahogany table sat men in expensive suits, their faces reflecting the kind of calculated indifference that had become the soundtrack of the music industry's transformation. "Tony, you have to understand the market," said Bruce Lundvall, the A&R executive who had been assigned to Bennett's account. His voice carried the practiced patience of someone explaining simple mathematics to a stubborn child. "Rock is where the money is. The Beatles changed everything. The Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd. That's what sells records now. That's what gets radio play." Bennett sat at the head of the table, his hands folded calmly in his lap, but his jaw was set in a way that those who knew him recognized as immovable determination. At 47, his hair was beginning to show silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting under stage lights and wrestling with an industry that seemed determined to reshape him. "Bruce, with all due respect," Bennett replied, his voice steady but firm, "I've been singing these songs for 20 years. They're not just songs to me. They're the American songbook. Gershwin, Porter, Berlin. These are the masters. You want me to abandon all of that for what? 3-chord rock songs about teenage rebellion?" The silence that followed was heavy with corporate frustration. Marketing charts and sales figures were spread across the table like evidence in a trial, each graph showing the same devastating truth. Traditional pop was dying, and Tony Bennett's career was dying with it. "Look at these numbers," interjected another executive, sliding a report toward Bennett. "Your last album barely cracked the top 100. Meanwhile, Carole King's Tapestry has been #1 for 15 weeks straight. 15 weeks, Tony. That's the sound people want to hear." Bennett picked up the report, but didn't look at it. Instead, he gazed out the window at the city below, watching people hurry along the sidewalks with their own dreams and struggles. "You know what I think when I see those people down there?" he said quietly. "I think about my father working construction until his hands bled, coming home and putting on a Bing Crosby record. I think about soldiers I knew in the war who carried photographs and hummed 'I'll be seeing you' because it reminded them of home. That music didn't die, gentlemen. You just stopped believing in it." The room shifted uncomfortably. These were business meetings, not philosophy sessions, and Bennett's emotional appeals felt out of place among profit margins and market demographics. "We're not asking you to abandon everything," Lundvall said, his tone growing more insistent. "We're asking you to evolve, adapt. Look at what Frank did. He recorded Strangers in the Night, My Way. He found ways to bridge the old and the new. Frank Sinatra is Frank Sinatra." Bennett responded with a slight smile. "He could sing the telephone book and make it sound good, but I'm not Frank, and I'm not going to pretend to be someone. I'm not just to sell records to teenagers who wouldn't know good music if it hit them in the face." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Corporate executives were not accustomed to artists who spoke so bluntly about their artistic integrity, especially not when sales figures were plummeting. "Then what exactly are you proposing?" asked the marketing director, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like he'd never been to a live concert in his life. "Because if we can't sell your records, we can't justify keeping you on the label." Bennett stood up slowly, straightening his tie with the same careful precision he used to adjust a microphone stand before a performance. "I'm proposing that we make the best music we can make. I'm proposing that we trust the audience to recognize quality when they hear it. And I'm proposing that if Columbia Records can't support that vision, then maybe it's time for me to find someone who will." The threat was delivered calmly, but its impact was immediate. Record labels didn't like losing established artists, even ones whose sales had declined. There was always the possibility of a comeback, and Bennett still had name recognition and critical respect. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Lundvall said quickly. "We value our relationship with you, Tony. We're just trying to find ways to make it work for everyone." "Then let me make it simple," Bennett replied. "I'll record the songs I believe in, the way I believe they should be sung. You can market them however you want, but I won't compromise the music. If that's not good enough, then we don't have anything to discuss." 2 hours later, Bennett found himself walking through Central Park, trying to clear his head after the confrontation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the walking paths. Children played on playgrounds while their parents watched from benches, and the scene reminded him of simpler times when music was about joy and connection rather than market research and demographic targeting. His phone rang, a bulky device that he carried reluctantly, a concession to the modern world he often felt uncomfortable navigating. It was his manager, calling with news about potential bookings. "Tony, I just got off the phone with the Sahara in Vegas. They want to book you for 2 weeks in November, but they're asking about your song selection. They want to make sure you're keeping up with current trends." Bennett stopped walking and sat down on a park bench, watching a group of jazz musicians setting up for an impromptu performance near the fountain. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you're Tony Bennett. You sing the songs that made you famous. But Tony, we need to be practical here. If venues start demanding contemporary material, we're going to have a problem. Then we'll play different venues," Bennett said, his voice gaining strength as he watched the jazz musicians begin their set. "There are people out there who still appreciate good music. We just have to find them." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, covering cancelled bookings, reduced fees, and the growing difficulty of finding venues that wanted traditional pop music. When Bennett finally hung up, he felt the weight of his situation settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. But as he listened to the jazz quartet playing an impromptu version of Autumn Leaves, something inside him shifted. The music was pure, honest, and beautiful. It didn't need electronic enhancement or market research. It just needed musicians who believed in it and audiences who were willing to listen. That evening, Bennett returned to his apartment on the Upper West Side and sat at his piano. The instrument was a beautiful Steinway Grand that had been a gift to himself after his first #1 hit. Now, in the quiet of his living room, he played softly, working through songs that had sustained him through good times and bad. He thought about the meeting at Columbia, about the pressure to change, about the possibility that his career might be coming to an end. But as his fingers found the familiar chords of "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," he remembered why he had become a singer in the first place. It wasn't for the executives in boardrooms or the numbers on sales charts. It was for moments like the one he was living right now, alone with the music, feeling the truth of every note, connected to something larger than industry trends or commercial success. Outside his window, the city hummed with its endless energy, full of people searching for something real in an increasingly artificial world. Tomorrow, he would continue fighting for his artistic vision. Tonight, he would simply sing. The phone call came at 6:30 in the morning, jarring Tony Bennett awake from a restless sleep filled with dreams of empty concert halls and silent audiences. His manager's voice was tight, with barely controlled panic, the kind of tone reserved for genuine emergencies in the entertainment business. "Tony, we have a problem. The Copacabana cancelled. They're saying the pre-sale numbers are too low to justify the booking." Bennett sat up in bed, running his hand through his graying hair as the reality of his situation crystallized with painful clarity. The Copa had been his refuge, the place where he could always count on finding an audience that appreciated his artistry. If they were losing faith in his drawing power, the implications were devastating. "What's the official reason?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "They're being polite about it, talking about shifting demographics and evolving entertainment preferences. But the truth is simple. They don't think you can fill the room anymore." After hanging up, Bennett stood at his apartment window, looking out at Manhattan as the city began its daily awakening. Construction workers were already heading to job sites, businessmen emerging from subway stations with newspapers tucked under their arms, street vendors setting up their carts for another day of honest work. These were his people, the audience he had always sung for, but somehow the connection between him and them had been severed by an industry obsessed with youth and novelty. The financial reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Record sales had plummeted to levels that barely justified studio costs. Concert bookings were drying up as venues chased acts that could guarantee packed houses and heavy bar sales. His agent had been honest about the situation. Unless something changed dramatically, Bennett would need to consider alternative career paths. But what alternative could there be? Music wasn't just his profession. It was his identity, his language, his reason for existing. The thought of selling insurance or teaching voice lessons in some suburban music school felt like a kind of death. The morning brought another blow in the form of a review in Variety, the industry Bible that could make or break careers with a few carefully chosen words. Bennett's latest album had received what the trade called a respectful dismissal, praise for his technical skill wrapped around the devastating conclusion that his style belonged to a bygone era. "Bennett remains a master craftsman," the reviewer had written, "but in today's musical landscape, craftsmanship feels increasingly irrelevant. Rock and roll has taught audiences to value raw emotion over polished technique, and Bennett's pristine delivery, while admirable, lacks the urgency that modern listeners demand." The words stung because they contained enough truth to be genuinely wounding. Bennett had always prided himself on his technical precision, his ability to interpret a lyric with intelligence and sophistication. But perhaps the reviewer was right. Perhaps the world had moved beyond the need for such things. That afternoon, he found himself in the recording studio for what might be his final session under his current contract. The musicians were top-tier professionals, men who had played with everyone from Basie to Ellington, but even they seemed subdued by the atmosphere of ending that hung over the session. "What do you want to start with, Tony?" asked the arranger, a long-time collaborator who had scored some of Bennett's biggest hits. Bennett looked at the sheet music spread across the piano, songs that represented decades of American musical excellence. "Let's do The Way You Look Tonight," he said quietly. "If this is going to be the end, let's at least end with something beautiful." The session that followed was perhaps the most emotionally charged of Bennett's career. Knowing that it might be his last chance to record these songs professionally, he poured everything he had into each performance. The musicians responded in kind, playing with the kind of passionate intensity usually reserved for live performances. During a break between takes, the saxophonist, a veteran of the Goodman and Miller orchestras, approached Bennett with an expression of genuine concern. "Tony, I've been playing these songs for 40 years, and I've never heard you sing them better than you did just now. Don't let the business side of this thing make you forget how good you are." The comment was meant to be encouraging, but it only deepened Bennett's sense of isolation. He was singing better than ever, but fewer people seemed to care. Technical excellence and emotional honesty meant nothing if there was no audience to receive them. After the session, Bennett drove aimlessly through the streets of Manhattan, past venues where he had triumphed in better times. The Blue Note was advertising a folk singer he'd never heard of. The Village Vanguard had posters for a jazz-rock fusion group. Even the traditional jazz clubs were adapting to changing tastes, booking acts that bore little resemblance to the music that had made these rooms legendary. He stopped at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, a place where the owner still recognized him and didn't treat his presence as a nostalgic curiosity. The food was simple but genuine, prepared by people who understood that some things should never be compromised for the sake of fashion. "You look troubled, Mr. Bennett," said the owner, an elderly man whose family had run the restaurant for 3 generations. "Just thinking about change," Bennett replied, "about what happens when the world moves on without you." The old man nodded with the wisdom of someone who had watched his neighborhood transform around him. "Change is inevitable, but character is permanent. You don't change who you are just because the world gets confused about what it wants." The simple philosophy struck Bennett with unexpected force. Throughout his career, he had compromised on many things: song selection, arrangement styles, promotional strategies. But he had never compromised on the fundamental honesty of his performance, the belief that music should touch people's hearts rather than simply move their feet. That night, Bennett sat at his piano and played for himself, working through songs that had sustained him through decades of professional uncertainty. As his fingers found the familiar progressions, he began to understand that the choice before him wasn't really about career survival. It was about artistic integrity. He could spend the next few years chasing trends, trying to adapt his style to fit whatever the market demanded. He could record rock songs and folk ballads, hoping to recapture some measure of commercial relevance. Or he could accept that his time in the spotlight might be ending and focus on making the kind of music he believed in, regardless of its commercial potential. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than a recognition of something that had always been true. Tony Bennett was not going to change his artistic vision to accommodate an industry that had lost its way. If his career was ending, it would end on his terms, with his integrity intact. As midnight approached and the city settled into its late-night rhythm, Bennett continued playing, each song a declaration of independence from the commercial pressures that had nearly convinced him to abandon everything he held dear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new rejections, new evidence of his commercial irrelevance. But tonight, alone with his music and his convictions, Tony Bennett was exactly who he was meant to be. The letters arrived in a steady stream throughout the summer of 1975, each one a small miracle that helped sustain Tony Bennett through the darkest period of his career. They came from housewives in Ohio, retired teachers in Florida, young musicians struggling to make their own way in an indifferent industry. Each envelope contained the same basic message: his music mattered, his artistry was appreciated, and somewhere out there, people were still listening. Mrs. Eleanor Crawford from Akron wrote about how "I Left My Heart in San Francisco" had been playing on the radio when she received the Warner Brothers Records building in Burbank, stood like a monument to reinvention in the California sun of 1986. Tony Bennett walked through the glass doors with a confidence that surprised even him. At 60 years old, most artists would be contemplating retirement, but Tony felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in over a decade: hope. Danny Bennett, now 33, and wearing a sharp business suit that made him look every inch the music executive he was becoming, walked beside his father with folders tucked under his arm. The younger Bennett had spent the last 3 years studying the music industry with the intensity of a general preparing for war. He understood something that the record executives of the 70s had missed. Authenticity was about to become the most valuable commodity in entertainment. "Dad, remember what we talked about," Danny said as they approached the elevator. "You don't need to change anything about who you are. They need to understand why that's exactly what the world needs right now." The elevator carried them to the executive floor, and Tony found himself thinking about the last time he'd been in a record company building for a meeting like this. Columbia Records, 1973. The taste of defeat still lingered in his memory like stale coffee. But this felt different. He was different. The conference room was smaller than the intimidating boardroom at Columbia, but it hummed with a different kind of energy. 3 executives sat around a polished wood table, and Tony recognized the hunger in their eyes, not the desperate scrambling to follow trends, but the calculated ambition of people who believed they were onto something significant. "Mr. Bennett," said Patricia Rodriguez, the A&R director, rising to shake his hand. "I have to tell you, I've been listening to your recordings from the 50s and 60s. That voice, that interpretation, it's exactly what's missing from music today." Tony settled into his chair, his hands steady in a way they hadn't been during those dark Columbia meetings. "Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate that. But I have to ask, what's changed? 10 years ago, nobody wanted to hear what I was doing." Mark Stevens, the label president, leaned forward with the enthusiasm of a man who'd found buried treasure. "Everything's changed, Tony. The market's oversaturated with synthesizers and drum machines. People are hungry for something real, something with substance. Look at what's happening. Frank's Duets album is selling like crazy, and he's older than you are." Danny opened his folder and spread out marketing reports and demographic studies. "The baby boomers are entering their 40s. They have disposable income and they're nostalgic for quality. But here's the thing. It's not just them. College kids are discovering this music too. They're tired of being told what to like by MTV." The Tony listened as they discussed marketing strategies and tour possibilities, but his mind wandered to something deeper. He thought about the woman at the Fairmont Hotel who had cried during "I Left My Heart in San Francisco" just the week before. He thought about the young jazz student who had approached him after a small club gig in Berkeley, eyes shining as he talked about how Tony's phrasing had taught him something about emotion that no music school could. "There's something I need you all to understand," Tony said, his voice cutting through the business chatter. The room fell silent. "I'm not interested in making a comeback. That implies I was gone, that I need to change who I am to be relevant again. I never left. I just kept doing what I believed in, even when nobody was listening." Patricia exchanged glances with her colleagues. This wasn't the desperate artist they were used to dealing with, the kind willing to sacrifice artistic integrity for a shot at the chart. "What I'm interested in," Tony continued, "is finding people who understand that great songs are timeless. That quality doesn't have an expiration date. If we're going to work together, it has to be with the understanding that I sing the great American songbook because these songs mean something. They've meant something for 50 years, and they'll mean something 50 years from now." Mark Stevens smiled, and Tony could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. This wasn't just about selling records to middle-aged consumers. This was about positioning Warner Brothers as the label that understood the difference between trends and truth. "Tony," Mark said, "what if I told you we want you to make exactly the album you want to make? No pressure to update the sound, no suggestions about covering contemporary hits, just you, your voice, and the songs you love." For the first time in 15 years, Tony Bennett felt like someone in the music industry was speaking his language. The meeting continued for another hour, but the real business had been concluded in those first 20 minutes. They talked about producers. Tony suggested his longtime collaborator Ralph Sharon, and nobody objected. They discussed song selection. Tony mentioned wanting to revisit some Rodgers and Hart classics, and Patricia's eyes lit up. They planned a modest recording budget that would allow for live strings and real studio musicians instead of synthesizers. As they rode the elevator down, Danny couldn't contain his excitement. "Dad, did you hear what they said about the tour possibilities? The Hollywood Bowl, Carnegie Hall. These aren't small club dates anymore." Tony nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He was thinking about the songs, about the stories they told, about the audiences who would hear them. Success wasn't about revenge against the industry that had dismissed him. It was about reconnection with the music, with the audiences, with the part of himself that had never stopped believing. "You know what the real victory is here, Danny?" Tony said as they stepped into the California sunshine. "It's not that they want me back. It's that I never really left. I just waited for the world to catch up." 3 weeks later, Tony found himself in Ocean Way Studios in Hollywood, the same facility where Frank Sinatra had recorded some of his greatest work. The control room buzzed with quiet efficiency as sound engineers adjusted levels, and Ralph Sharon ran through arrangements with a small orchestra of Los Angeles's finest session musicians. Tony stood in the vocal booth, headphones around his neck, looking through the glass at the scene that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. But something was different this time. There was no pressure to prove anything, no desperation to reclaim lost glory. There was just the music. "Ready when you are, Tony," came Ralph's voice through the intercom. They started with "Steppin' Out with My Baby," and from the first note, Tony felt something click into place that had been missing for years. His voice, weathered by time and experience, carried depths that his younger self couldn't have accessed. The pain of the lean years, the wisdom of survival, the gratitude of second chances, it was all there in his phrasing. By the time they reached "The Way You Look Tonight," the entire studio had fallen into that magical silence that occurs when musicians know they're capturing something special. Tony closed his eyes and let the song flow through him, remembering every woman he'd ever loved, every audience that had ever listened, every moment of beauty that had sustained him through the darkness. When the song ended, the silence stretched for a long moment before the engineer's voice crackled through. "That's a keeper." Danny, watching from the control room, felt tears prick his eyes. This was his father as he was meant to be, not fighting against the current of popular music, but standing firm in his own stream, letting the world come to him. The album that would emerge from those sessions, The Art of Excellence, wouldn't set the charts on fire. It would do something more significant. It would announce that Tony Bennett was back not as a nostalgia act, but as a living artist whose best work might still be ahead of him. But first, there would be the tour. Small venues at first, then larger ones as word spread. And somewhere along that journey, in a theater whose name would be remembered long after the reviews were forgotten, Tony Bennett would stop a concert to speak to a crying woman, and in doing so, remind everyone present why music mattered in the first place. The Paramount Theater in Denver sat like a jewel in the heart of downtown, its Art Deco facade gleaming under the October evening lights of 1987. Built in 1930, the venue had hosted everyone from Bing Crosby to Bob Hope during its golden years, then struggled through decades of decline before a recent restoration had returned it to its former glory. Tonight, it would witness something that would become part of its legend. Tony Bennett stood in the narrow backstage area, adjusting his tie in a mirror that had reflected the nervous energy of performers for nearly 60 years. The pre-show rituals were as familiar to him as morning coffee. Vocal warm-ups, a review of the set list with Ralph Sharon, a quiet moment to center himself before stepping into the lights. But tonight felt different. The sold-out crowd of 1,200 represented more than just ticket sales. Word was spreading about Tony's renaissance, and the audience buzzed with anticipation that went beyond mere entertainment. They were there to witness something they sensed might be special. 5 minutes, Mr. Bennett," came the stage manager's voice. Danny appeared at Tony's shoulder, straightening his father's collar with the attention to detail that had become his trademark. At 34, Danny Bennett had transformed from the youngest son, trying to help his father, into a sharp-eyed manager who understood both the business and the art of his father's career. "The house is electric tonight, Dad," Danny said. "I can feel it from here." Tony nodded, taking a deep breath that carried decades of experience. He'd learned to read audiences before he'd even stepped on stage, to sense their mood, their needs, their willingness to be transported. Tonight's crowd felt ready for a journey. Ralph Sharon appeared with his sheet music perfectly organized, the same careful preparation that had characterized their partnership for over 20 years. "Tony, I've been playing piano for a lot of singers, but I want you to know you're singing better now than you ever have. There's something in your voice that wasn't there even 5 years ago." It was true, though Tony couldn't have articulated exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the peace that came from surviving the wilderness years, or the confidence that grew from refusing to compromise. Maybe it was simply that his voice, like fine wine, had developed complexities with age that his younger self couldn't have imagined. The curtain rose to thunderous applause, and Tony walked into the warm wash of stage lights with the easy confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was. The Paramount's acoustics wrapped around his voice like a perfectly tailored suit, and from the opening notes of "I've Got the World on a String," the audience was his. He moved through the first set with the skill of a master storyteller, each song chosen not just for its musical merit, but for its place in the emotional arc of the evening. "The Way You Look Tonight" brought couples in the audience closer together. "I Left My Heart in San Francisco" generated the kind of knowing applause that comes when an audience recognizes they're hearing something iconic. But it was during "The Shadow of Your Smile" that Tony first noticed her. She sat in the fourth row, slightly left of center, a woman perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair and elegant posture that spoke of a lifetime of grace. She was well dressed, but not ostentatious, the kind of person who understood that true class was about quality rather than flash, and she was crying. Not the obvious sobbing that would have drawn attention from other audience members, but the quiet tears of someone deeply moved, someone for whom the music was unlocking emotions that had been carefully contained. Tony had seen it before. Music had the power to reach places that nothing else could touch, to speak to griefs and joys that had no other voice. He continued with the song, but part of his attention remained on the woman. There was something about her tears that spoke to him, something that suggested they came from a place deeper than mere appreciation for a beautiful melody. These were the tears of recognition, of memory, of connection to something profound and personal. As the song concluded and the audience applauded, Tony made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of moving into the next number on the set list, he stepped closer to the microphone and let the applause fade to silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the intimate quality that could make 1,200 people feel like they were in his living room. "Before we continue, I want to share something with you about why I do what I do." The theater fell into the kind of silence that occurs when an audience senses something unscripted and genuine is about to happen. Tony's eyes found the woman in the fourth row, and though the stage lights made it difficult to see the audience clearly, he could sense her attention like a palpable force. "Music," Tony continued, "isn't just entertainment. It's not just something to fill the silence or provide background to our lives. Music is communication between souls. It's how we tell each other that we're not alone, that someone else has felt what we're feeling, that our deepest emotions have been acknowledged and honored." He paused, letting the words settle in the theater's perfect acoustics. In the fourth row, the woman had stopped crying, but her attention was focused on him with an intensity that he could feel even through the stage lights. "I see you out there," Tony said, and though he didn't point or specify, somehow everyone in the theater understood he was speaking to someone in particular. "I see that this music means something to you, that it's touching a place in your heart that maybe hasn't been touched in a while, and I want you to know that's exactly why these songs were written. That's exactly why I sing them." The silence in the theater was complete now, the kind of hush that occurs when 1,200 people are holding their breath together. Tony could sense the shift in energy, the way the evening was transforming from performance into communion. "Music is memory," he continued. "It's love made audible. It's the way we hold onto the people we've lost and celebrate the people we've found." So if this music is moving you, if it's bringing back memories or touching emotions you thought you'd forgotten, don't apologize for that. That's what it's supposed to do. In the fourth row, the woman was crying again, but now her tears were different. They were the tears of someone who felt seen, understood, validated in their deepest emotional response. Around her, other audience members were wiping their eyes, feeling their own connections to the music, their own memories awakened by Tony's words. "Tonight," Tony said, "we're all in this together. We're sharing these songs, these moments, these feelings, and that makes us more than just an audience. It makes us a community." The applause that followed was unlike anything Tony had experienced in his decades of performing. It wasn't just appreciation for entertainment, it was gratitude for acknowledgement, for permission to feel deeply in a world that often discouraged such vulnerability. As he moved into the next song, "The Good Life," Tony noticed that the entire theater had shifted. Couples held hands more tightly. Strangers shared knowing glances. The woman in the fourth row sat straighter, her tears now flowing freely, but without shame. The rest of the first set passed in a blur of connection and communication that went far beyond the usual performer-audience relationship. Songs became conversations, melodies became bridges between hearts, and the theater transformed into a sacred space where emotions could be shared without judgment. During intermission, the Rainbow Room perched atop Rockefeller Center like a glittering crown on Manhattan's skyline, its Art Deco elegance perfectly complementing the autumn of 1995. Tony Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city stretch endlessly below as afternoon shadows grew long across the concrete canyons. At 69, his face carried the weathered dignity of a man who had survived every storm the music industry could conjure. "Dad, they're ready for you in the studio," Danny Bennett called from across the room, his voice cutting through the gentle hum of conversation among the assembled musicians and producers. The younger Bennett had grown into his role as manager with the same precision his father brought to his art, calculated, passionate, and uncompromising in his vision. Tony turned from the window, adjusting his navy blue suit jacket with the unconscious grace that had become his trademark. The Rainbow Room had been chosen specifically for this album session, Tony Bennett on Holiday, because its atmosphere captured something ineffable about the American songbook tradition. The space itself seemed to exhale history, having hosted everyone from Frank Sinatra to Ella Fitzgerald during its golden years. "You know, Danny," Tony said, walking toward the makeshift recording studio they had constructed in the room's main space, "there was a time I thought I'd never see the inside of a place like this again. Not as a working musician, anyway." The recording equipment hummed softly. State-of-the-art technology nestled incongruously among the room's 1930s fixtures. Ralph Sharon sat at the grand piano, his fingers dancing across the keys in warm-up scales that seemed to paint the air with possibility. Behind him, the rhythm section, bass, drums, and guitar waited with the patient professionalism of musicians who understood they were part of something larger than a simple recording session. "Tell me about the arrangements again," Tony said, settling onto a stool near the microphone. His voice carried none of the uncertainty that had plagued him during the dark years of the 70s. This was a man who had rediscovered not just his audience, but his own artistic identity. Ralph looked up from the piano, his eyes bright with creative enthusiasm. "We're treating each song like a conversation, Tony, not just between you and the audience, but between you and the music itself. Take White Christmas. Instead of the traditional big band treatment, we're going intimate. Piano, brush drums, subtle bass. Let your voice carry the emotion." Tony nodded, understanding immediately. The years of struggle had taught him that authenticity couldn't be manufactured or forced. It had to emerge naturally from the intersection of technique, emotion, and genuine human connection. He had learned this lesson the hard way, watching younger artists chase trends while he remained committed to the timeless principles that had first drawn him to music. "You remember that concert in Boston last month?" Tony asked the room, his eyes taking on the distant quality they assumed when he was accessing a particularly vivid memory. "There was this moment during The Way You Look Tonight when I could feel the entire audience breathing with me, not just listening, breathing. That's what we're after here." The first song they tackled was "I'll Be Home for Christmas," and from the opening notes, everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something special. Tony's voice had aged like fine wine, gaining depth and gravitas without losing its essential warmth. He didn't simply sing the lyrics, he inhabited them, transforming familiar words into a meditation on longing, memory, and the complex emotions that surround the holiday season. "The snow is falling, the wind is calling," Tony sang, his voice wrapping around each syllable like silk. But it was more than technical proficiency. There was a lived-in quality to his interpretation, as if he were drawing from decades of actual Christmases, actual separations, actual homecomings. During the break between takes, Tony found himself thinking about the woman he had met after the Carnegie Hall concert just weeks earlier. She had approached him at the stage door, tears still visible on her cheeks, and thanked him for what she called the most beautiful 3 minutes of my life. She had been referring to his performance of the Christmas song. But Tony understood that what had moved her wasn't just the song. It was the recognition that someone understood the weight of memory, the bittersweet nature of holidays that could simultaneously represent joy and loss. "That's what this album is about," he told Danny during a quiet moment between songs. "It's not about selling records or chasing charts. It's about honoring the tradition while making it personal. Every song needs to feel like I'm singing it to one person. Someone who needs to hear exactly those words at exactly that moment." Danny smiled, recognizing the philosophy that had guided their remarkable comeback. "That's why it's working, Dad. People can tell the difference between singing and communication. You've always been a communicator first." The afternoon stretched into evening as they worked through the holiday classics. Silver Bells, The Christmas Waltz, White Christmas. Each song receiving the careful attention of master craftsmen who understood that perfection lay not in flawless technique, but in emotional honesty. Tony's voice moved through the familiar melodies, with the confidence of a man who had found his way home after years of wandering in the wilderness of commercial pressure and artistic compromise. As they prepared to record "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," Tony paused at the microphone stand, his hand resting lightly on its chrome surface. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the recording equipment and the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic far below. "You know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the studio, "there are songs that exist just to be sung, and then there are songs that exist to heal. This is one of the healing songs." He looked directly at Ralph, who nodded and began the introduction, simple, elegant, heartbreaking in its restraint. When Tony began to sing, his voice carried not just the words of the song, but the accumulated wisdom of 7 decades. The hard-won understanding that music's greatest power lay not in entertainment, but in its ability to touch the deepest places of human experience. The final notes hung in the air long after Tony had finished singing, as if the Rainbow Room itself were reluctant to let the moment pass. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered with 10 million lights, each one representing a life, a story, a heart that might someday be reached by these songs they were creating. "That's a keeper," Danny said softly, breaking the spell. Tony nodded, stepping back from the microphone with the satisfaction of a craftsman who knows he has done good work. But more than that, he felt the deep contentment that came from understanding his place in the great tradition of American popular music, not as a relic or a curiosity, but as a living bridge between past and present, between the golden age of song and whatever came next. The Kennedy Center Opera House possessed the kind of acoustic perfection that could make a whispered prayer sound like thunder, and on this October evening in 1998, It hummed with the anticipation that preceded truly special performances. Tony Bennett stood in his dressing room, adjusting his bow tie with the methodical precision of a man who had performed this ritual thousands of times, yet still treated each performance as if it were his first. 5 minutes, Mr. Bennett, came the voice through the intercom, young and respectful in the way that suggested the speaker understood they were addressing someone special. Tony looked at himself in the mirror, seeing not just his own reflection, but the ghosts of every performance that had led to this moment. At 72, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who had survived the music industry's attempts to change him, who had emerged from professional exile, not bitter, but grateful, not compromised, but refined. The occasion was significant. A benefit concert for the Kennedy Center's education programs, with proceeds going directly to music education in underserved communities. It was exactly the kind of cause that Tony had always supported, understanding instinctively that music education wasn't just about creating future performers, but about giving young people access to the transformative power of artistic expression. "You ready for this, old friend?" Ralph Sharon appeared in the doorway, dressed in his performance tuxedo, his face bearing the gentle smile of a man who had shared countless stages with Tony over the decades. "Ready as I'll ever be," Tony replied, though they both knew that readiness for Tony Bennett was less about preparation and more about presence, the ability to step onto a stage and create immediate intimacy with 2,000 strangers. The walk from the dressing room to the stage wings felt longer than usual, perhaps because Tony was acutely aware of the weight of this particular performance. The Kennedy Center represented something sacred in American cultural life, and tonight's audience would include senators, Supreme Court justices, foreign diplomats, and Washington's cultural elite. But more importantly to Tony, it would also include regular people who had saved their money to buy tickets, music lovers who understood that they were witnessing something increasingly rare in contemporary entertainment. Artistry without pretense, sophistication without condescension. The stage lights dimmed, and Tony heard the familiar rustle of an audience settling into expectant silence. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in prayer, but in gratitude, for the voice that still served him, for the songs that had sustained him, for the opportunity to stand once more before people hungry for authentic musical communication. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcer's voice, warm and reverential, "Tony Bennett." The applause began before Tony stepped into the light, building to a crescendo that seemed to lift the opera house's ornate ceiling. But it wasn't just applause, it was recognition, acknowledgement of a career that had spanned 7 decades and survived every trend, every technological revolution, every attempt by the industry to declare his style obsolete. Tony walked to center stage with unhurried grace, his presence immediately transforming the vast space into something intimate and personal. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the lights, letting the audience's energy wash over him like a familiar blessing. "Good evening, Washington," he said simply, his voice carrying easily to the farthest reaches of the opera house without amplification. "It's beautiful to be here with you tonight." The opening song was "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," and from the first notes, Tony could feel the audience lean forward, drawn into the gravitational field of his performance. But something was different tonight. He could sense it in the quality of their attention, the way they seemed to hang on each syllable. This wasn't just polite appreciation. This was communion. As he moved through the first set, "The way you look tonight, body and soul, I want to be around." Tony became aware of the individual faces in the front rows. There was the elderly woman in the third row who mouthed along with every word, her eyes closed in evident rapture. The young couple in the orchestra section who held hands and swayed gently to the rhythm. The distinguished gentleman in the box seats who had removed his glasses to wipe away what appeared to be tears. But it was during "Fly Me to the Moon" that Tony's attention was drawn to someone specific, a woman in her 50s, sitting in the 7th row, center section. She wasn't singing along or swaying or smiling. She was crying. Not the gentle tears of someone moved by music, but the deeper, more wrenching tears of someone experiencing profound emotional pain. Tony finished the song to thunderous applause, but his mind remained focused on the crying woman. During the brief pause as Ralph transitioned to the next song, Tony found himself studying her face more closely. She was well-dressed, clearly someone who belonged in this sophisticated crowd, but her grief was so raw, so visible, that it seemed to create its own space around her. The next song was supposed to be "Steppin' Out with My Baby," but Tony raised his hand slightly, and Ralph, reading the signal with the intuition of long partnership, paused at the piano bench. "You know," Tony said, his voice carrying the conversational intimacy that had always been his greatest gift, "sometimes music finds us exactly when we need it most. Sometimes a song can say what we can't say ourselves." He looked directly at the crying woman, his eyes gentle but not intrusive. The entire opera house seemed to hold its breath. "I see someone out there who's carrying a heavy heart tonight," Tony continued, his voice soft but somehow reaching every corner of the vast space. "And I want you to know that whatever you're going through, you're not alone. Music has always been about connection, about reminding us that our deepest feelings are shared, that our sorrows and joys are part of the human experience we all navigate together." The woman looked up, startled to realize that Tony had noticed her, that he was speaking directly to her across the expanse of the theater. Other audience members began to turn in their seats, but not with curiosity, with compassion, as if Tony's acknowledgement had given them permission to witness her pain without judgment. "Ralph," Tony said, turning to his longtime pianist, "let's sing 'The Best Is Yet to Come' for our friend here." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary 3 minutes in Tony Bennett's legendary career. He sang not to the audience but to one person, transforming a theater holding 2,000 people into an intimate conversation between a man who had survived every form of professional and personal hardship and a woman who needed to hear that survival was possible. "Out of the tree of life I just picked me a plum," Tony sang, his voice carrying all the authority of someone who had lived through the darkness and found the light on the other side. "You came along and everything started to hum. Still, it's a real good bet the best is yet to come." The woman's tears didn't stop, but they changed, from tears of despair to something else, something that looked remarkably like hope. When the song ended, the applause was different from anything Tony had ever experienced. It wasn't just appreciation for a performance. It was recognition of something profound that had just occurred, an acknowledgement that they had all witnessed music fulfilling its highest purpose. Tony waited for the applause to subside, then spoke once more to the crying woman. "Thank you for letting me sing to you tonight," he said simply. "Sometimes that's all we can do for each other. Sing the songs that remind us we're not alone." Later, after the concert, after the standing ovations and the backstage congratulations, the woman found Tony at the stage door. She was composed now, though her eyes still showed traces of the evening's emotion. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice steady but soft, "my husband died 3 weeks ago. 47 years of marriage. I didn't know how I was going to go on. Tonight, for the first time since he passed, I remembered that I still have a life to live." Tony took her hands in his, understanding that this was why he had been given his gift, why he had survived the wilderness years, why music had chosen him as one of its vessels. "He sent you here tonight," Tony said gently. "Music has a way of carrying messages from the people we love." As she walked away into the Washington night, Tony stood for a moment on the Kennedy Center steps, looking out at the Potomac River flowing dark and endless toward the sea. He understood that something fundamental had shifted during tonight's performance, that the boundary between entertainer and audience had dissolved into something more profound, a recognition that